What do a broken crucifix, a pair of work gloves, and a white coffin have in common? You're about to find out in this fun-sized felony. Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica, and this is a fun-sized felony. Before we begin, no felony is ever fun. When I say fun-sized, I mean the story is short, not that the crime itself was light or trivial. In this story, we're going back to Brooklyn, New York in 1925. By the time Florence Kane reached her neighborhood on the night of May 29th, 1925, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a city just after midnight, when the last trains have emptied and the streets begin to thin. She had just called her mother to say she would be home in about 30 minutes, but somewhere between the subway station and her front door, something stopped her. The next morning, Florence was found in a vacant lot in Brooklyn. She had been beaten, bound, gagged, and strangled. Her jaw was broken on the left side. Her face had been battered so badly that she was almost unrecognizable. Some of her belongings were missing. Others had been left behind in a careful little arrangement across the small of her back, including a crucifix that was broken from her rosary, a religious medallion, her lipstick, and her face powder. It was not a scene of random chaos. Something about it felt deliberate. Intentional even, maybe personal. And whatever happened to Florence Kane in those final moments, it was never solved. Florence Kane was 29 years old in 1925. In some newspaper coverage, they shaved a few years off her age and kept saying she was 24, but she was 29. She lived in Brooklyn with her widowed mother. She worked as a stenographer and assistant secretary in the office of John Dillon, the former food commissioner who published The Rural New Yorker in Manhattan. She had held that job for several years, actually. She was described as gentle, reserved, trustworthy, cheerful, and old-fashioned. She was part of a sewing club. She was also devoutly Catholic, and she attended St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Church. She carried a rosary and a medallion of St. Joseph with her everywhere she went. She sounded, by all accounts, like a steady and beloved daughter who lived a fairly quiet life. On the night before her murder, Florence had gone out with a group of female friends to a theater performance in Manhattan. These friends were all part of the same sewing club that she was part of. The show was Louis XIV. Newspaper reports differ a little on the size of the group. It may have been a dozen women or just 8, but the important part is this. She had spent the evening doing something ordinary and fun. She was not sneaking around. She was not engaging in anything dangerous. She was just out with friends, attending a show and then heading home. At some point in the trip back, she called her mother and said she'd be home within half an hour. Imagine that moment. Imagine just the utter normalcy of it. A daughter calling home late at night to say, "I'm on my way." There's nothing in that phone call that suggests fear, nothing that signals that anything is wrong. It is one of those heartbreakingly ordinary moments that only becomes devastating in hindsight. The show that she had seen with her friends was over at about 11:30 p.m., and then she had to take a series of subway trains to make it back to her house. Florence got off at the Utica Avenue station and began what should have been a short walk home. Just 6 blocks remained. Now, her brother James was a Brooklyn detective, actually, and he had reportedly warned her many times not to walk home alone from the station late at night. And according to one account, Florence had brushed off that advice and said that girls who minded their own business were left alone. And that line is just unbearable. It captures the logic so many women have had to live by. If I do everything right, if I keep to myself, if I'm careful, if I just keep my head down, I will be safe. But Florence was walking through one of the most undeveloped sections of Brooklyn. There were as many vacant lots as there were houses. The lot where her body would later be found was strewn with rocks and refuse. Now, across from this lot was a Department of Street Cleaning dump where they would dump stuff that they swept up off the street. Now, the lighting in the area was poor, and there had been a street lamp there at that intersection where the lot was, but it had been broken by children that very same day. The neighborhood had blind spots, and there were dark stretches and open ground where someone could disappear frighteningly fast, just running through lots, right? And Florence was not being carefree. It's not like she was just ignoring her surroundings, but she was simply trying to get home. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., neighbors heard screams. A woman named Mrs. Leah Ehrenstoft was awakened by what she described as the terrible scream of a woman. A few seconds later came 3 or 4 weaker screams, and then the sound died away into what one paper called a choking sob. Another neighbor, Mrs. Milan, also heard the screams, and she supposedly woke her nephew, Charles Byers, who was sleeping beneath a window overlooking the lot. They looked out into the darkness, but they could not see clearly enough to understand what was happening. And then there were other neighbors. It was a mother and her 15-year-old daughter who recalled hearing a woman cry out, "Mama, oh, mama, mama, mama." And then the 15-year-old looked outside and she said, "Mom, I see a man running." And they watched a man run out of the lot. And all the while, across the street, Florence's own mother, Elizabeth, and her sister, May, were awake and waiting for her. They had been watching from an upstairs window, frightened by how late she was by that point. Their bedroom window looked straight out over the very lot where Florence was dying. Her mother was waiting in the dark for her daughter to come home. Florence's mother and sister had lit a candle in the window so she could see it, while they waited for her. And as they waited and watched, they had no idea that Florence was dying in a vacant lot, literally just a couple 100 feet away from their home. They were diagonal across the street from this lot. At 6:05 that morning, a milkman named Christian Junker found her body in the vacant lot at East New York Avenue and Montgomery Street, just a half a block from her home. The scene was horrific. Florence was lying face down. Her hands had been bound in front of her. She had been gagged with fabric torn from her own skirt. Her face was swollen and bloodied. Her jaw was broken on the left side. Her lips were twice the size that they should have been. One of her shoes lay near the road, and the other was next to her body, which was about 20 feet back from the sidewalk. Her clothes had been torn off her body. She had been beaten and strangled. The medical examiner believed the assailant had used his fingers to force down her throat in order to silence her screams. When I saw that, I was thinking, that can't be accurate. It made me think of the nose print that was supposedly left on a handkerchief in the Zolly Clement episode. I was like, there's no way he reached his fingers down in her throat. But I consistently kept seeing that through all of the newspaper coverage. So I Googled it and said, is this a way that people strangled people? And it said that that had been done mostly like in historic accounts of crimes. So I found that very interesting. However, they did see like thumbprints on the front of her neck. So she was manually strangled as well as having fingers shoved down her throat. I feel like that would be dangerous because the person would bite you. I don't know.
Ouch.
I mean, I've never tried to strangle someone, so I guess it's a good thing that I don't know. Now, Florence had not been raped, but the condition of the body and the torn clothing make it very hard not to conclude that sexual violence was part of the attack, whether it was completed or not. They think that perhaps after he killed her, then he was like, well, now, I'm not interested anymore. I guess not into necrophilia, and then ran away. But later they said that she had succeeded in fighting this guy off from ruining her integrity, but she had paid for it with her life. Now, next was this strange arrangement at the scene. On the small of Florence's back, because remember, she's face down, someone had placed several items in an orderly way. A crucifix had been broken off of her rosary, and then her medallion of St. Joseph, her lipstick, and her box of face powder. And they were all laid out on her back. In one account, they were laid on top of a blood-stained handkerchief that was put down first. Now, at the same time, there were some things that were missing. The blue beaded rosary that the crucifix had been broken off of, that was missing. She had a yellow gold wristwatch that sounded actually really, really cool. That was missing. Also missing was the rest of her skirt. So, strips had been torn from the skirt to tie her hands together in front of her. And then another bit of it was shoved in her mouth as a gag. And then even more, another strip from it was wrapped around her head to hold the gag in place. But the rest of the skirt was gone. So the person had taken the skirt with him. Some things were taken, some things were left, and some things were arranged. And that's one of the details that lingers the most, because that doesn't feel accidental. It doesn't feel like the random scattering left behind in a struggle, right? I mean, he took those things and he placed them on her back. Whether it was meant as mockery or ritual or symbolism, or just something else entirely, we don't know. But it does make the crime feel colder and more deliberate. The family horror deepened almost immediately. Florence's brother, Detective James Kane, was summoned to the scene because a girl had been found dead in a vacant lot. When he arrived, he realized it was his own sister. Can you imagine that? So he identified her body himself while she was still laying there in the dirt. Florence had planned to actually visit her father's grave that day and bring flowers. Their father had died a couple decades earlier. But instead, that day, her family was making arrangements for her burial. Now, I do want to pause here and say something that may or may not be true, but I think it's worth considering. Florence's mother said that Florence had no interest at all in what she called, quote, the masculine sex. She said that Florence had never had a sweetheart and that Mary O'Rourke was her most intimate companion. Now, the name is either Mary or Marie. It depends on which article you're reading, but it's O'Rourke as the last name. Now, Mary O'Rourke had been one of the girls with her that night, part of that group. And I do not want to overstate what we can't prove. We do not know Florence's identity in the way that we might want to know it now, but I do think it's fair to wonder whether Florence may have been more emotionally attached to women than she was to men, and whether that might have made her a vulnerable target, which, I mean, the newspapers didn't say anything about that, but just explaining how Mary was, like, hysterical. Like, Mary was almost as upset as Florence's mother. And then to hear, they were the most intimate friends. She didn't like men. It made me wonder. I know that on her way home from the theater, she was with Mary O'Rourke and Mary's sister, Elizabeth, as well as one other girl. And so the four of them rode together from the theater on the subway. And then at one point, Mary O'Rourke and her sister got off, so then it was just Florence and this other friend, and then those two eventually split apart as well. But I had to wonder when I first stumbled upon this idea, this possibility, if perhaps there had been a man on the subway who saw some sort of interaction, like, a holding hands when they thought no one could see, or something, maybe he saw something and he was like, that's not right. And he followed her and committed a hate crime. Like that was a thought that I had. And then maybe, the placing of those religious items on her back was some kind of statement he was making. And along with her makeup, the powder and the lipstick, it could mean something, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't. This could have been just completely random. I mean, was she attacked by a man enraged by rejection or by difference or like some private grievance. We don't know. But anyway, that possibility just hangs there. And there were actually other women being attacked in the area, and I mean a lot. This was a terrible place for women to be at night. So that is one of the reasons this case feels bigger than one unsolved murder. In the weeks surrounding Florence's death, like both before her death and after, multiple women in Brooklyn reported late-night attacks involving a man grabbing them by the throat, throwing them to the ground, beating them, tearing at their clothes, and robbing them. And that's basically exactly what happened to Florence. One woman named Tessa Miller, she was thrown down, she was battered in the face, and strangled with a hand at her throat. Another one, Gussie Cooperberg, she was beaten, choked, robbed, and left unconscious with torn clothes and a broken nose. A girl named Helen Connors escaped an encounter near the same general area on the same night that Florence was killed. It was like half an hour before they believed that she died. And what makes this even more disturbing is that these attacks didn't stop with Florence. Just days later, two young women, Catherine Peschel and Janie Katinsky, were walking home from a party in the early morning hours when they realized they were being followed. So they started running. Janie Katinsky fell down 2 times, but she was able to get back up. But Catherine Peschel, she fell and she could not get up fast enough. So Janie Katinsky, she kept running. She was screaming for help, and that did eventually get some help for them. But the man who had been chasing them, he caught up to Catherine, and he grabbed her by the throat and began beating her on the ground. She was screaming, and this time, unlike Florence, somebody did hear the screams and did come to save her. So 2 men rushed in, they managed to stop the attack, and they held the guy until the police arrived. When he was arrested, this man, his name was George Benson, he told the police that he had just done it, quote, for a lark. So I was just playing around. So he was charged actually with 3rd-degree assault and held on $500 bail, which was a lot of money in 1925. And while he had an alibi for the night that Florence was murdered, the fact remains this kind of violence was happening in the same neighborhood, in the same way, to lots of women who were walking home in the dark. So it's entirely possible that Florence was killed by the same kind of prowler who had already been stalking women in that neighborhood. And it's also possible that her case only drew major attention because this time the victim was the sister of a detective. The investigation, though, unfortunately, was a mess. At first, police immediately fixated on Black men in the area, not because of evidence, but because of racism. Literally from the moment that Captain John Coughlin and Acting Inspector John J. Sullivan took a look at the scene, they said it had to have been a Black man due to the position of the body, she was face down, and then the nature of the attack. There was also a pair of stained gloves that were found beside Florence's body, and they said that they were likely worn by a Black janitor who would have been responsible for tending furnaces and carrying out ash. So they were assuming that, the stains were made by the ashes. So they rounded up all the Black men who were employed as janitors in the area, and they harassed them, and they floated these ugly assumptions in the newspapers. They attached the crime to this whole vile fantasy of the, quote, degenerate Black attacker. They had 3 Black men in custody at the same time, and then they would, let a couple go and then arrest another one. So it was just ongoing and really annoying to read about. But anyway, later, some investigators and reporters decided, never mind, it couldn't have been a Black man. It had to have been a white person after all. And I was like, good for you, but the reason why they said it was just as racist and absurd. So honestly, it was like painful to read this stuff. These people, they were not doing science. They were not really following evidence. They were just using prejudice as a substitute for investigation and then calling it expertise. And while they were doing all of that, they were also completely bungling the physical evidence. According to major criticism in the press, like too many people were there trampling the area where the body was, and it's true. And apparently, as far as like evidence goes, these objects were literally picked up and handled with bare hands by the detectives. So, I mean, they were like, well, yeah, we looked for prints on the crucifix, but they had picked it up first before doing that with their own hands. At that time, with the New York police in 1925, they had what was called a homicide kit that they would take with them. And in the homicide kit was a pair of forceps that they were supposed to use to pick up items of evidence, so they wouldn't contaminate them. But they didn't do that. They didn't do it. They picked up everything with their hands. They walked all over the place. There were so many people there. I mean, it was ridiculous. Now, it wasn't until a reporter named Thomas Rice from the Brooklyn Eagle, he published an article on May 31st, so 2 days after the murder, as well as June 1st. And he was just saying in these articles, like, I really think they need to test her gloves because if she fought for her life, there might be, evidence on her gloves. Well, apparently that never occurred to the detectives. And in fact, those other gloves that had been found, they never even sent those to be tested either. So it was after seeing what that reporter had put in the paper that they were like, oh, yes, evidence should actually be tested. So the thing is, when this later came up too with all of this criticism, they didn't even know who to send these things to. Which expert should be testing this? Where should this go? So they wound up sending it to the wrong laboratory. And then from that laboratory, they sent things to the correct chemist. And it was 5 days after the murder that he received these things to test. They made those assumptions about the gloves belonging to a black janitor because they thought, there would be ashes on them. And then when the gloves were finally examined properly, there were no ashes at all. There were mineral stains and human blood, but by then, valuable time had been lost. And in other words, Florence Kane's case was not just unsolved, it was mishandled, contaminated, racialized, and then slowly buried under incompetent police work. As the days passed, the theories multiplied and the certainty vanished. There was talk of a red taxicab, and there was a nervous young man in a candy store that had shown up that night. He was really nervous and shaky. He shows up at a candy store, he orders a soda, and then he asked the store owner if she had heard about, quote, the rumpus that happened on Montgomery Street. He said that he had seen 4 police officers arrest a young woman. And the interesting thing is the police had no record of that. Someone else said that they saw a young woman being stuffed into a red taxi cab. There were local suspects, there were drifters, street cleaning workers, and then men who were picked up almost at random. There were claims that the killer must live within a mile of the scene. There were later articles suggesting the murderer was likely a white man known to the family who lived in the neighborhood. And they were on the hunt for this guy, but we never find out who it was. There were threats that Florence had reportedly received before her death. Like an anonymous letter had shown up at the house, and it said that she was too stuck up and she needed to be dragged off somewhere. There were even ugly rumors much later that the police were suppressing a family scandal. It was actually a black pastor who, during his sermon, he brought this up. And he said that the police know very well who killed her, and they're keeping it quiet to avoid revealing a family scandal. Now, in the end, the theories only multiplied because the evidence had not been protected well enough to narrow them down. But the only evidence they had, like the only thing they had to go on was those gloves. And so the gloves themselves, it was a pair of gloves stuffed into another pair. So the inside pair of gloves was made of cotton. They were white with like green trim around the wrist. And then those were inside of some leather gloves. So It looked like these gloves would have been worn by someone who worked hard labor, but because of the stains on them, they figured the person must work with vehicles. It was some kind of like oil or something like that. So that really got them looking at the street cleaners whose dump was right across the street. So they did, follow some leads, but because they hadn't even sent in the gloves, to be tested until 5 days after the murder, they had already started looking at black men, assuming that there were ashes on the gloves. But yeah, it's crazy. And now let's talk about the funeral. The city's response to Florence's funeral tells you just how deeply this case struck the neighborhood. The first phase of mourning was already unbearable. On Memorial Day, so a day or two after the murder, Florence was lying in a metallic casket at a funeral home. Her face was covered to hide the damage that was done to her, and her mom kept crying out, "Poor Floss, they've taken Floss." Her sons could not let her go near the casket. They didn't want her to see her baby in that way. People were coming from all over. They were coming to see the vacant lot where her body was found. They're just morbidly curious. People were walking there. People were driving there. And they had a lot of plainclothes detectives among the crowd. So they didn't look like detectives, right? But they were hoping that the killer might return to the scene. So they were watching these people very, very closely. It was June 2nd when Florence's full funeral was held. Florence was buried in a white coffin, which was traditionally meant just for children. But her mother insisted that she be buried in a white coffin because Florence had always been her baby. Ever since the murder, Mrs. Kane had been described as a broken little figure. She was keeping to the house. She wasn't talking to people other than her other children. Crowds had gathered outside of the Kane home, and there were people lining the streets. And then there were lots of people in St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Church where the Mass would be held. There were perhaps 100 men in the crowd, but the papers made clear that women overwhelmingly filled the procession and lined the route. There were 100 carriages, with the first 3 filled with flowers. Women on the sidewalks openly wept as the funeral procession passed. As the organ played and the high funeral mass was celebrated, women sobbed and prayed for her soul. Mary O'Rourke, her most intimate friend, she was hysterical at the funeral. And there were 3 women who fainted, actually. Now, Mrs. Kane, who was exhausted beyond tears, that's what the paper said, she just kept muttering throughout the funeral, "Floss, my poor girl, Floss." And then Father William J. Costello, when he finished delivering the Mass, he moved to go and stand near the head of the coffin. He spoke first about Florence's mother sitting by the window and listening into the darkness. He said that only 200 or 300 feet away, her daughter had been fighting to preserve her honor, and she had preserved it with her life. And then he raised his voice and he demanded, "Where is this murderer now?" And in the silence after that question, the women in the church sobbed. Father Costello did not stop there. He blamed the city administration of New York for failing to provide proper police protection. He said the men who had denied enough funding to increase the police force bore responsibility for what had happened. He even said that the black crepe hanging at the Kane home ought to be taken down and draped instead over the door of City Hall. Now, let me explain that. When Father Costello talked about that, he was referring to something that his listeners would have immediately understood. A crepe, spelled C-R-E-P-E, but sometimes spelled C-R-A-P-E, it was a dull, crinkled black fabric that was traditionally used as a sign of mourning, especially in Victorian England, but it was just a tradition that had made its way over here as well. Now, this crepe would be draped over the front door of a home to let the neighborhood know that someone inside had died. So when Father Costello said it should be taken from the Kane home and hung over the doors of City Hall, he was making something very clear. This was not just a private tragedy. This was a failure that belonged to the entire city. Well, after the Mass, the procession moved on to Holy Cross Cemetery. At the grave, Father Costello said a brief prayer, while Mrs. Kane, Detective James Kane, her son, and the rest of the family just wept. And still, even there, detectives moved through the crowd hoping for some clue. Maybe some whisper, some strange face, some slip of the tongue that would tell them who had done it. But again, the gloves remained the only tangible clue, and they were not enough. Florence Kane's murder was never solved. By July, newspapers were already calling it, quote, permanently unsolved, and that is where it remains today, 101 years later. What stays with me most in this case is not just the brutality, though that is, hard enough to shake. It is the nearness of everything. Florence was almost home. Of course, I saw some details and did a little digging, and I do have a theory. Now, I want to be very clear here. This is not evidence. It's not proof. It's just something that makes me pause. One of the people who heard screams that night was a teenage boy named Charles Byer, and he was living in the home with his aunt, May Zalon. He was right there, said the papers, sleeping beneath a window that overlooked the lot. Well, in another article published later, it said that Mrs. May Zalon and Charles Byer had not actually gone to bed yet. Now, there were pictures of both May Zalon and Charles Byer in the newspaper, and I noticed that Charles has the face of a demon. Now, if you listened to the Hill Family Axe Murders episode, you know that when I saw the picture of Corwin Harvey, my first reaction was, he has the face of a demon, and I was mostly joking until I realized he had died in prison. And that's what got me looking deeper into Corwin Harvey, and I found out that he was, in fact, a very, very bad man. So anyway, almost as a joke, I was looking into this and I was texting with Olivia, and I told Olivia that Charles Byer had the face of a demon. The papers said that he was in high school, and through some digging, I found out that he was actually 18 at the time of Florence's murder. I wanted to dig deeper into this because many of the investigators said that the killer most likely lived in the area, and Charles and his aunt lived in the house that bordered that lot. They were right next to it. The newspaper called the Daily News launched their own inquisition, just looking at all of the available evidence and, just piecing things together. And they came to a very interesting conclusion. Florence must have known her killer because she was strangled to death when she was already unconscious. They were like, if she's unconscious, why not just run away? But instead it was like, well, shoot, I need to make sure she never wakes up. And then he strangled her. So they do believe that is because, the attacker knew she could identify him if she woke up, and therefore he just needed to silence her forever. Charles Byer, the 18-year-old, he would have seen Florence on a daily basis, walking to and from the Utica station to get to work and to visit her friends. And the newspaper said he was awake. Even if the newspaper said he was sleeping, it doesn't mean he was, because his aunt may have been protecting him. They could have just said that, oh, I was asleep, wasn't me. So I decided I needed to look into that household. I couldn't find anything about Charles Byer at all. But what I did find was troubling. Years after the murder of Florence Kane, Mrs. May Zalon committed suicide. I had been able to find her death certificate, which is how I found that out, and it said that her body was released to her husband, Louis Zalon. Louis had not been mentioned in any articles previously, so I had no idea she was even still married. I had no idea that this man existed at all. So I searched for his name in newspapers.com to see what I could find, and I found that Louis Zalon had a history of violence. At the age of 26, Louis had assaulted and robbed a man, which sounds familiar. Louis Zalon had done this, he had committed this crime with the help of a 20-year-old accomplice, and both of them faced charges. But I couldn't find any news on the outcome of that case. I imagine he likely went to prison for a short time, but if you guys have listened, to all of our episodes so far, you know that when they went to prison, even if they had a lengthy sentence, they would be paroled within like 2 or 3 years, right? And the murder of Florence Kane happened about 12 or so years. I would have to go back and look to be sure, but it was like, 12 years or so after he had gotten in trouble with those charges. So I assume he was probably out of prison at that time. My question was Charles also violent because he'd been living in a majorly dysfunctional home with his aunt and uncle? I mean, there had to have been a lot going on, considering his aunt committed suicide later. I mean, that in and of itself says that there were some mental health problems. Could it have been because he was abusive to her, or was it just her being mentally ill? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it really paints the picture of a home where instability and violence were not unfamiliar. Another question, was Lewis home? Was he living in the house at the time? Had he seen Florence? Could Lewis have been responsible? Maybe he wasn't mentioned because they were covering for him. It was just the aunt and nephew who were home. Who knows, right? Now, again, none of that proves anything, about Charles Byer himself. But yeah, when you have a brutal crime committed in near total darkness, just steps away from homes full of people, it's not hard to wonder whether the answer wasn't far away at all.